Throughout history, there have been many different things that have been seen as motivation for people walking into a school, whether that be an elementary school, a high school, or a post-secondary school, and opening fire on the people within. This week we're going to look at a case from Canada that's been widely argued and criticized. When the massacre happened, it seemed pretty clear what the motive was, but it has become much debated. Perhaps what is worse is that over the years, people seem to have weaponized the attack, and rather than turning it into a memorial, some have turned it into an axe to grind, making the killer's name come up and be remembered, and leaving wounds for many people who were a part of it. Hello, my name is Lance, and welcome to episode 147 of Gone But Never Forgotten, the École Polytechnique Massacre. Camille Rodrigue-Lias Garby was born on October 26th of 1964 to his parents Monique Lepine, who was a Canadian nurse and former nun, and Rachid Lias Garby, who was an Algerian businessman. When Camille was born, Rachid was traveling in the Caribbean, reportedly for work, but Monique uncovered evidence that Rachid had been having an affair. Rachid was a non-practicing Muslim, and Monique was a former Catholic nun who had rejected any kind of organized religion when she had decided to leave the convent. Camille was baptized as a Catholic when he was an infant, but Monique said that he never attended church and he was a confirmed atheist for his entire life. In 1987, Monique and Rachid would have a second child, Nadia, Camille's only sibling. Rachid worked as a mutual funds salesman, and as such the family, during the younger years for the children, existed in a world that was filled with instability and also filled with violence. The family moved frequently with the children, spending much of their very early lives living in Costa Rica and Puerto Rico. That was until 1978, when the family moved back to Montreal permanently, right before the stock market crashed and the family lost most of their assets. Rachid was very vocal about the fact that he did not believe that women were anything close to equal to men, and he was also physically, emotionally, and mentally abusive to Monique as well as to Camille and Nadia. When Rachid was abusive to his children, which was often, he would forbid Monique from consoling the children and helping them in any way to deal with the scars that Rachid would impress upon them. He said that if she consoled the children after he physically abused them, she would teach them to be soft. Rachid was also a very possessive man, and he believed that whatever he said went, and he believed that the lives of his wife and children were his to control. Further to that, Rachid forced Monique to work as his personal secretary for no pay and no benefit, and she was also forced to do this at the expense of their children. If the children were crying or seeking attention, Monique was not to ever stop what she was doing to console them in any way. It was very clear that Camille and Nadia were nothing more than a nuisance to Rachid. What was more, whenever Monique would make a mistake in a profession that she had never been trained in, mind you, Rachid would slap her across the face and force her to redo things over and over and over again to show and assert his dominance. In 1970, Rashid would beat on Gamil, and he hit Gamil so hard that the marks were left on his face for over a week after the incident, and that was finally the beginning of the breaking point for Monique. Monique decided that she needed to leave Rashid for the sake of the children. She would go stay elsewhere, but Rashid followed her and essentially forced her to return back home with the children, continuing that cycle of abuse that was non-stop in the lives of the young family. This, though, did not last long, thankfully, and finally Rashid was told that the marriage was over, and Rashid did leave the family home. Gamil and Nadia stayed with Monique, and Rashid would make a whopping 2 child support payments to his wife before that stopped, and he then defaulted on mortgage payments, causing Monique and the children to have to leave their home and leave behind all of their possessions in an attempt to start over. Rashid started out also seeing his children once a week in a supervised visit before that too fell off, and neither child nor Monique ever saw Rashid again. It was said that Gamil never spoke of his father to anyone and that he was terrified of Rashid as a child. The legal separation between Monique and Rashid would be finalized in 1971, and the divorce would not be finalized until 1976, but the change in life and the lack of any support from Rashid caused Monique to need to pivot. Monique needed to provide for her family, and so she returned to nursing, and she started attending school to upgrade her degree and to advance her career. During that time, Monique was forced to have her children stay with other families during the week as she worked and attended school, and the family would spend their weekends together. In 1976, Monique made the decision to seek a psychiatric assessment for herself and for Gamil and Nadia, because she believed that with everything that the family had been through, there was likely some serious damage done, and they all needed to be assessed. The family would see a psychiatrist at St. Justine Hospital in 1976 when Gamil was 12 and Nadia was 9. The assessment concluded that while Gamil was shy and withdrawn, there was nothing that stood out as being wrong with his mental health. Nadia, however, was concluded she needed therapy because she was starting to challenge Monique's authority. Also in 1976, things seemingly started to turn a corner for Monique and the children, as Monique had landed a job as a director of nursing at a Montreal hospital, and the family all began to live together full-time again. In 1977, Monique was even able to purchase a home in the middle-class suburb of Pierrefonds. All of the hard work and time away from the family had seemingly paid off, and Monique had managed to get the family back on their feet all on her own. In junior high school and high school, Gamil was described by staff and students as shy, quiet, and reserved, and he obtained average to above average grades. In those developmental years of his life, Gamil made only one really close friend, another boy named Eric Cossette. Aside from Eric, Gamil never really fit in at all with any other students. He was also met with a lot of racism because of his name, and at the age of 14, he decided that he wanted to change his name, both because of the racism and because of the hatred that he harbored for his father. He did not want to carry his father's name. Gamil was, of course, not of legal age to change his name, and his mother did not want to sign off on the name change either. But Gamil began from that time forward to be known as Marc Lépine, taking on his mother's maiden name. Marc was sadly not only bullied because of his race. He was also bullied because he had chronic acne, and because of all of the abuse that he had taken at the hands of fellow students, it was said that he did have incredibly low self-esteem. Marc was not even able to take solace in a relationship with his sister because she had turned out to be one of his worst bullies. She would publicly make fun of Marc for his acne, and she publicly made fun of him because he had never had a girlfriend. This fed into an ever-growing dark side of Marc because even when he went home, he had to deal with torment. Marc often fantasized about the death of Nadia, and he even made a mock grave once to show how thoroughly he hated his sister. Because Marc didn't have a male role model in his life when he was younger, Monique had fostered a relationship between he and his uncle, and one of the things that the two did together was shoot air rifles. As a teenager, Marc owned an air rifle, and he would use that to shoot at pigeons near his home with his friend Eric. Both Eric and Marc also liked to design and build electronics. When the relationship between Marc and his uncle fell out, Monique then signed him up with the Big Brothers program, and Marc had a big brother for 2 years, and the two of them, as well as Eric, often did things together. The three would do photography, they would fiddle with electronics, and they spent a lot of time around motocross motorcycles. That relationship too, though, would come to an end in 1979 rather abruptly. It has been reported that Big Brothers had filed a complaint against his big brother, and he had been detained on suspicion of molesting young boys. Both the big brother and Marc said that there was no molestation that had taken place. Marc also developed around this time a deep interest in World War II and even an admiration for Adolf Hitler. He also enjoyed spending a lot of his time watching action and horror movies. Things were seemingly not all bad in Marc's life, though. He did take on considerable responsibility at home, helping his mom with cleaning and other repairs around the house. He really stepped up. And then in 1981, when he was 17 and Nadia was 14, she was placed into a group home because Monique could not parent or control her any longer. Nadia had become out of control, and she was addicted to drugs and also was completely disregarding Monique and her authority. Marc could not have been happier than he was when Nadia was moved out of the family home. It was in this year that Marc applied to join the Canadian Forces as an officer cadet, but he was rejected during the interview process. Marc had told Eric at the time that it was because he had difficulties accepting authority, and he would later say in his suicide letter that it was because he was antisocial. An official statement came after the massacre from the military, and they said that Marc had been interviewed, assessed, and ultimately it was determined that he was unsuitable for the cadets. It was clear that Marc was intelligent, but reserved and troubled, and he did have an issue with authority. It also started to become clear around this time that Marc's growing hatred for feminists was reaching a boiling point. It's unclear if that is something that he had carried over from his father or something that had bubbled up inside of him independently, but he said that he hated career women, and he hated women who took jobs in what he considered to be traditionally male-dominated jobs. He often mentioned policing and political positions. In 1982, the family moved to St-Laurent, which was closer to Monique's work and to Marc's college. During this time, Marc lost contact for a while with Eric, his one true friend, and he would describe these years as the worst of his life, and he said that nothing in his life brought him any joy during this time. In August of 1982, he began a 2-year pre-university course in pure sciences at CEGEP de Saint-Laurent, and he failed 2 courses in his first semester, which was certainly out of the ordinary for him. He improved dramatically, though, in the second semester, and he also started to work part-time at the hospital where Monique was working. He worked in the cafeteria serving food and doing custodial duties. Even at work, though, people remembered him after as a nervous, hyperactive, and immature young man. After 1 year in that program, Marc switched into electronics technology, which was a 3-year technical program, and it was geared more towards finding work than when finished than a pre-university course, which is obviously geared towards attending university. His professors remember Marc as a model student, one who was quiet and hardworking, and they said that he did well in his courses, especially excelling in electro-technology. Marc, though, seemed to lose interest again over time. His marks dropped drastically in the fall semester of 1985, and then in February of 1986, his last term for the course, he stopped going to classes unannounced, and thus failed to complete his diploma. Around this time as well, Marc moved out of his mother's house and got himself an apartment. In 1986, Marc applied to the École Polytechnique, and he was approved for the course, but tentatively. He needed to finish 2 prerequisite university courses that he did not have to complete his admission. In 1987, Marc was fired from his job as a cleaner and server at the hospital. It's been said that he was fired because of aggressive behavior and because of disrespect of his superiors. He also had become incredibly careless in his work. Marc was absolutely enraged by the fact that they had the gall to fire him, and at the time it was said that he would go off on rants about committing a murderous rampage and then taking his own life. His few acquaintances said that after he got fired, he would become unpredictable, and that he was prone to flying off the handle in fits of rage when he became frustrated by anything. After losing this job, he applied again in 1989 to the École Polytechnique, and then he moved in with his friend Eric in an apartment that was located in downtown Montreal. He also started to take one of the courses that was a prerequisite to garner admission at the school. He did actually finish that course in the winter of 1989. Around this time, though, along with his anger and frustration, Marc started to be more vocal about his deep-rooted hatred for women. He started to speak out freely about the fact that he hated feminists. He also said that he hated career women and women who worked in those same occupations that he had mentioned as a teenager, such as policing and political offices. And so, that was the state of Marc's life at the time that the massacre took place. He was angry. He was very much not a fan of feminism or of women who held offices that he felt they were beneath, and he very much believed that women belonged being at the behest of their husbands and other men in the workplace. He felt that women were weak. For me, I wonder how much of that was rooted in the fact that his own father had indoctrinated him in those ways as a young child. I also wonder how much of that was rooted in the fact that perhaps he felt neglected by his mother when she was pursuing her own career, and how much of that was rooted in the fact that society at large was moving towards equality between genders. Regardless of why Marc thought and believed and acted as he did, he was in a lot of trouble inside of his own head, and was about to change many, many lives for generations to come. On December 6th of 1989, sometime after 4 p.m., Marc Lépine arrived at the building that housed the École Polytechnique, which is an engineering school that is affiliated with the University of Montreal. Marc had with him a Ruger Mini 14 rifle and a hunting knife. Both were inside of a plastic bag that he had. I should mention that investigators after the fact would show that Marc had been to the campus at least 7 times in the weeks that led to the massacre. The Ruger Mini 14 rifle was something that Marc did legally own. He had purchased the gun and ammunition less than a month before, on November 21st, in a Checkmate Sports store in Montreal. When he had purchased the gun and ammunition, he had hauntingly told the clerk that he was buying the weapon with the intention of hunting small game. On December 6th, Marc first made his way to the office of the registrar on the second floor of the building, and he did not speak to anyone on the way there, nor did he speak to anyone once he arrived inside of the office. He entered and just took a seat in the waiting room, seemingly gathering himself for what was to come. A staff member actually approached him and asked him if she could help him in any way, and he did not even offer a response. He just sat there and looked ahead, sporadically rummaging inside of the plastic bag that he had with him. The staff did not take much note of the young man seated there, as it was the last day of classes before Christmas break, and as such a lot of the students were bogged down with exams and projects, and it was suspected that he just needed a moment for himself. When he left the office, he was seen in other parts of the building, wandering the corridors, and then he finally entered a second-floor mechanical engineering class that had approximately 60 students inside. This was at approximately 5:10 p.m. When Marc entered the room, there was a female student at the front of the room giving a presentation. Marc spoke up when he felt initially ignored, and he told everyone to stop what they were doing, and he then ordered the people in the room to separate, with the men in the classroom to go to one side of the room and the women to go to the opposite side of the room. At first, nobody in the classroom moved because they assumed that it was some kind of end-of-term prank. When Marc realized that he was not being taken seriously, though, he discharged his weapon into the ceiling, and everyone quickly realized that this was no joke. There were approximately 50 men inside of that classroom and 9 women, and they separated as Marc had demanded. He then turned to the men and told them to leave, which they did. He then turned his attention to the women that were still in the room, and he asked them if they knew why they had found themselves in the situation that they were presently in, and the position that they were presently in. None of the women responded to his question, and instead, one of the women asked him who he was. Marc said that he was there at the school because he was fighting against feminism. One of the students in the class, Natalie Provost, spoke up, and she told Marc that they were women who were studying engineering, and that they were not feminists who were fighting against men or marching to prove that they were better. In response to that, Marc opened fire indiscriminately on the line of women, shooting all of them from left to right. And in that act, he immediately took the lives of 6 of the women that were in that room, and he wounded the other 3. Hélène Colgan, Natalie Croteau, Barbara Daigneault, Anne-Marie Lemay, Sonia Pelletier, and Annie st-Arneault all lost their lives in that classroom. Before leaving the room, Marc went to a student's project and he wrote the word shit on it. Eric, Marc's closest friend, would later say that shit and oh shit were 2 of Marc's favorite sayings. Marc then continued into the second-floor corridor and he wounded 3 more students in the corridor before he entered another room where he attempted to shoot a female student who was again giving a presentation. He attempted to shoot her twice, but his gun misfired, and he quickly left the room into an emergency exit staircase, and he worked at properly reloading his gun. Once he had the gun reloaded, he attempted to return back into the room from where he had just come, and he found that the students inside had locked him out. Marc then fired 3 shots into the door in an attempt to get the door to open and break the lock, but he was ultimately unsuccessful, and instead he moved along another corridor and started to shoot at other people. He wounded 1 and then moved towards the financial services office where he shot and killed Maurice Lagunière through a window in the door that he had just locked to prevent him from entering. Marc then continued on and went down to the first-floor cafeteria where there were about 100 people gathered. He shot a nursing student, Barbara Maria Kucznik-widjewicz, near the kitchens, and he also wounded another student. As you can imagine, the sound of a gun in that cafeteria caused the crowd that was assembled there to flee in panic, and Marc then continued on and entered into an unlocked storage area that was at the end of the cafeteria. And that was where he shot and killed two more women, Anne-Marie Edward and Genevieve Bergeron, who were attempting to hide inside. Marc then demanded that a male and female student who were hiding under a table come out from underneath it, and when they complied, he did not shoot them. To me, that seemed certainly like a reach of power. Marc wanted to know how two terrified people would react if he demanded that they come out from hiding, and when they listened, when they obeyed his commands, he spared their lives. Sadly, though, he was not finished. Marc then took an escalator up to the third floor of the building where he shot and wounded one female and two male students inside the corridor. From there he found another occupied classroom, and he entered and immediately told the men to get out, and he shot and wounded Maurice Leclerc, who was giving a presentation in the room on a platform at the front of the class. Marc then opened fire on the students that were sitting in the front row, and he killed Maud Haviernick and Michelle Richard, who got up and tried to flee the classroom. Other students in the room started to dive under tables and anything else that they could hide under or behind, and Marc then turned his attention on more of the female students and wounded 3 of them, and also took the life of Annie Turcotte. He then changed his magazine inside of his gun and moved to the front of the room and started to fire his gun wildly in all directions until he stopped when he heard a voice. The voice he heard was Maurice Leclerc, who he had initially shot when he entered the room. At that point, she was pleading for someone to help her, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, Marc unsheathed his hunting knife and proceeded to stab her 3 times in the heart, taking her life. Marc then removed his hat, wrapped his coat around his rifle, and said, "Oh shit," and then shot himself in the head, taking his own life. Everything that happened inside of the school took place in only 20 minutes. When his body was found, it was discovered that he had approximately 60 more cartridges that he had not fired on his person. Now, just last week we talked about the massacre at Sandy Hook, and we talked about the impeccable reaction time of the police and first responders who were inside of the school within 10 minutes of the first shots being fired. This case was not quite so. At the time and in the years since, the reaction of the police here in Montreal was very much scrutinized. The reality was that there was, in 1989, no policies in place for how to deal with a situation like this one. There were no protocols to follow for the first responders, and there was no action plan on how to deal with an active shooter situation. Security guards at the school were not trained well. They were not organized, and they were not properly equipped to deal with such a situation. Sadly, in Canada, even to this day, this is the case more often than not. Communications at the call center that fielded the 911 calls that came in caused delays of police and ambulances because they were all initially sent to the wrong address and wrong location. When the police did finally arrive on the scene, there was seemingly nobody in command, and while they did establish a perimeter around the building to ensure that a shooter could not escape, they were very slow to enter the building itself. Some of the women that lost their lives then had lost their lives between the time when the first responders arrived and when they entered the school. After the fact, there were at least 3 independent and official investigations that condemned the emergency response at the École Polytechnique. The only positive that could have come out of a situation like this then was change. It's been said that the police reactions in Canada at future similar situations were vastly improved. In situations such as the shootings at Concordia University, the Dawson College shooting, and the 2014 attack on Parliament Hill, it's been said that first responders responded much quicker and that their immediate intervention and better coordination led to lives being saved. Perhaps one of the most haunting stories surrounding the massacre was that of Montreal Police Director of Public Relations Pierre Leclerc. When Pierre arrived on the scene, his job was to quickly brief reporters on what the police knew about what was going on in the school, knowing full well that his daughter was inside of the school. After he did his job briefing the reporters, he went into the school himself, and that was where he would find the body of his daughter, Maurice Leclerc, who had been shot and stabbed at the end of Marc's rampage. The Quebec and Montreal governments were devastated, and they declared almost immediately days of mourning and a joint funeral for 9 of the women whose lives were tragically ended. That joint funeral was held at the Notre Dame Basilica on December 11th, 1989, 5 days after the massacre took place. The funeral was attended by thousands of mourners. Now, as we do here on GBNF, I want to pause and take the time to talk about each of the women who tragically lost their lives on that day. Geneviève Bergeron was 21 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. She was in her second year, and she was a scholarship student in mechanical engineering. Geneviève absolutely loved music, and she played the clarinet and also sang in the Montreal Symphony Orchestra. Geneviève had thought about studying music in university, but she instead chose engineering. She had just moved into an apartment with her best friend 6 months before her life was taken. In the summer of 1989, she had traveled with her mother to Morocco. She had just celebrated her 21st birthday 2 weeks before the massacre. When Geneviève wasn't studying or singing, she was swimming, playing basketball, or babysitting. She is remembered as a sweet, generous, and bubbly young woman who loved every moment of her life. She was a real ball of fire. Hélène Colgan was 23 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. She was in her final year of mechanical engineering, and she was interested in pursuing a master's degree. She was a studious young woman who would pick up and read anything that she could ever get her hands on, and she already had 3 job offers and was leaning towards working with a company that was based near Toronto. Her best friend, Natalie Croteau, was also a victim in the shooting. She was planning a vacation with her friends in Cancun, Mexico to ring in the new year. She was said to be conscientious and patient, and she always saw everything that she ever did through to the end. Her father said that she wanted to go to the furthest limits of life, and that she was full of ambition and hope. Natalie Croteau was 23 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. Natalie was 3 months shy of earning her degree, and she was a resident of the South Shore suburb of Brossard. She had 1 younger sister, and she was planning for that same trip with Hélène to Cancun, Mexico at the end of the month. Natalie was outgoing and enterprising, and she had a passion for learning, especially when it came to science. A community center in Brossard was named in Natalie's memory. Barbara Daniel was 22 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. She too was expecting to graduate from her program at the end of the year. Barbara was also a teaching assistant as well for her father Pierre, who was a mechanical engineering professor at the Université du Québec à Montréal. She was said to be someone who was never bound by conventional limits. When she was 7 years old, she asked why she could never become the Pope. She was said to have been a marvelous young woman who was very nice and very smart. She loved school, and she loved socializing with her classmates. Anne-Marie Edward was 21 years old at the time of her death, and she was a chemical engineering student. She loved being outdoors, particularly skiing and diving, and she was always surrounded by her friends. While she was at college, she fell in love with extreme sports. She played chess, cribbage, baseball, and soccer, and she learned how to kayak. She also was involved in school government. Anne-Marie extended her degree and her stay at the school by 1 term so that she could experience all of the things that she wanted to experience. She was known for being clever and for being stubborn. In 2013, the École Polytechnique named its new Science and Technologies building in her honor, and in 2014, her mom said that Anne-Marie would be proud to see her memory being used to end misogyny. Maud Haviernick was 29 years old at the time of her death, and she was a materials engineering student, specializing in composite metals. Maud had already earned herself a degree in environmental design from the Université de Québec à Montréal, but her dream was to become an engineer, and she thus returned to school. Maud had 2 sisters. She was said to have had a very energetic personality, and she was first and foremost an artist. Her mantra that she lived by was, "If you feel like going all the way, just do it." She lived with her long-term boyfriend in the north end of Laval, and in her memory, her sister Sylvie co-founded the December 6th Victims Foundation Against Violence, along with other people who lost loved ones in this attack. Maurice Lagunière was 25 years old at the time of her death, and she was a budget clerk in the École Polytechnique's finance department. She was the only woman that lost her life that wasn't a student at the school. She had her wedding just 3 months before the massacre, and she was said to have always had a smile on her face that would light up a room, and she was the youngest of 14 children raised in Montreal. Maurice's husband, Jean-François Larrivée, believes that Maurice was very newly pregnant when she lost her life. Jean-François still fights and advocates for gun control in her honor. Maurice Leclerc was 23 years old at the time of her death, and she was a materials engineering student. She was in her 4th year. Maurice was one of the top students in the school and just 1 year away from graduation. Her father, as mentioned, was Lieutenant Pierre Leclerc, and he was at the scene that day. She was a rebel and a go-getter who never gave 2 thoughts to what other people thought about her. She had 3 younger sisters, and Maurice liked to listen to British punk music and new wave music, and she had recently met and fallen in love with a man named Benoit, who was also a student at the school. Pierre tragically said that he had just had dinner with Maurice 2 weeks before, and he recognized the new Christmas sweater that she had worn and purchased for Christmas when he went into the school. Anne-Marie Lemay was 22 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. She was in her 4th year. Anne-Marie was the oldest of 2 sisters and had grown up in Boucherville, a suburb of Montreal. She was getting close to graduation, and she was a part of the team that was planning the festivities. Anne-Marie also sang in a rock band and was helping to raise funds for a class trip overseas. Initially, Anne-Marie wanted to get into healthcare, but ultimately chose mechanical engineering because of a close friend, Heidi Rathjen, who was doing the same. Anne-Marie was caring and selfless, and she was always intent on getting her studies done. In her honor, Heidi has become an outspoken advocate for gun control. Sonia Pelletier was 28 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. She was the head of her class and the pride of St-Ulrich, Quebec. She had 5 sisters and 2 brothers, and her family said that her dream was to return home and start her own engineering firm. Sonia died on her last day of classes before her final exams. She is remembered as the person who won every competition and secured every scholarship and always worked hard to be at the top of her classes. She was quiet and undemanding, and her intelligence and liveliness stood out to others. She loved rock music, and she loved to cook and teach others to cook. Michelle Richard, or Mimi as she was known to those close to her, was 21 years old at the time of her death, and she was a materials engineering student. Michelle was in her 2nd year. She was the oldest of 2 children, and she was raised by a single mom. She was incredibly close with her mom, and the 2 were best friends. She was a strong student, and she befriended everyone that she ever met. Shortly before her death, Michelle had reconciled with her long-estranged father because she was about to get married, and she wanted her father to be present at the wedding. She and Maud were presenting to the class when they were both murdered. Michelle was said to have a marvelous smile and a calming presence. She was described by her boyfriend as a gentle girl, happy, brilliant, beautiful, and he said that she lived every moment intensely, and she absolutely hated violence. Also, sadly, showing the ripple effects of tragedies like this, her father, who she had recently reconciled with, committed suicide almost 1 year after the massacre, and her mom would join with many other parents in advocating for stricter gun control. Annie St-Arneault was 23 years old at the time of her death, and she was a mechanical engineering student. She was the youngest of 3 siblings from La Turque, Quebec, and she had a keen interest in ecology. Annie lived in a small apartment in Montreal, and she had talked about eventually getting married to the man who she had been dating since the 2 were teenagers. Her life was taken as she was sitting in her very last class before graduation. She had an interview scheduled with Alcan Aluminum the following day, and she is remembered as a curious, meticulous, intensely caring, and adventurous young woman, and she was torn between taking a job with Alcan or joining her brother as a missionary in Africa. Her brother Serge published a collection of her poems in 2011 that she had written as a teenager in her memory. Annie Turcotte was 20 years old at the time of her death, and she was a materials engineering student. She was from Granby, Quebec, and she was in her 1st year of university and lived with her older brother in a small apartment that was near the university. She was the youngest of 3 siblings, and she was a very gifted student and was awarded a scholarship for women in science. She was described as gentle and athletic, and she loved to take apart cars as much as she loved to bake alongside her mom. She also loved to swim, and she had been a member of her high school swim team. Her dream was to improve the environment. Annie had taught swim lessons at a camp for children for free with disabilities, and she was always said to be amazing with children. Barbara Kucznik was 31 years old at the time of her death, and she was a nursing student in her 1st year. She and her husband were high school sweethearts, and they had moved from Poland to Montreal in 1987 because they felt that it was a much safer place to live, believing Canada was the safest place in the world. Barbara was a trained economist, but decided to make a career change as her husband, who was a Polish-trained physician, worked towards being a qualified doctor in Canada. She and her husband were in the cafeteria of the engineering school because it was the cheapest place to get a meal on campus. Barbara was outgoing, friendly, and she had what has been called a great deadpan sarcasm. She was well educated, spoke 5 languages, read a lot, and loved to help other people. 14 lives taken, and so many more lives irrevocably changed and tarnished because of 20 minutes of hell that were unleashed by Marc Lépine. These women were hard workers, and there is little doubt that all of them would have changed the world in some way, whether large or small. These were women, all of them, who were driven to be better and to do everything that they could to succeed. These are all heartbreaking ripples and women who will forever be remembered by their families, their friends, and people all over the world. Things like this just cannot happen. Also, I would be remiss if I did not mention the men and the other students that were in that school that day. There is no telling how a person might react in a situation with an active shooter, but there have been so many stories that have come out of the École Polytechnique massacre of people just wishing that they had reacted differently, thinking of lives that they might have saved if they had tried to take him down. And there are so many people who believe that it should have been them. You wind up with survivor's guilt, especially people who are in that classroom when the gun misfired. It's impossible to transition back into the tragedy after looking at the lives of these wonderful women and looking at the way that lives were forever changed because of this tragedy, but I have to do it, so here we go. On the day of the massacre, Marc wrote 3 letters. 2 of those letters he sent to his friends, and one was a suicide letter that was found in the inside pocket of his jacket when his body was discovered. At the time, the full texts were not disclosed, even though the media tried to use access to information laws to get their hands on the suicide letter. About a year after the attacks, though, the 3-page letter was leaked to a journalist and feminist named Francine Pelletier. The letter contained a list of 19 Quebec women who Marc said he wanted to kill because he considered them to be feminists. Pelletier was one of the names on the list, and there was also a well-known union leader, a politician, a TV personality, and 6 female police officers, among others. The letter, without names, was published in La Presse, a newspaper where Pelletier was a columnist. With the assistance of Julie, we are going to read this letter for you here, Julie joining me to read it in French, and then, of course, I in English. Here is the bulk of that letter.
Excusez les fautes. J'avais 15 minutes pour l'écrire. Veuillez noter que si je me suicide aujourd'hui, le 6 décembre 1989, ce n'est pas pour des raisons économiques, car j'ai attendu d'avoir épuisé tous mes moyens financiers, refusant même de l'emploi, mais bien pour des raisons politiques. Car j'ai décidé d'envoyer à Padre les féministes qui m'ont toujours gâché la vie. Depuis 7 ans que la vie ne m'apporte plus de joie et étant totalement blasé, j'ai décidé de mettre des bâtons dans les roues à ces viragos. J'avais déjà essayé dans ma jeunesse de m'engager dans les forces comme élève officier, ce qui m'aurait permis de possiblement pénétrer dans l'arsenal et de procéder l'ortie dans une rasa. Ils m'ont refusé à cause asociale. J'ai donc attendu jusqu'à ce jour pour mettre à exécution mes projets. Entre-temps, j'ai continué mes études au gré du vent car elles ne m'ont jamais intéressé, sachant mon destin à l'avance. Ce qui ne m'a pas empêché d'avoir de très bonnes notes malgré ma théorie de travaux, non remis ainsi que la carence d'études avant les examens. Même si l'épithète « tireur fou » m'a m'être attribuée dans les médias, je me considère comme un érudit rationnel que seule la venue de la francheuse ont amené à poser des gestes extrémistes. Car pourquoi préserver à exister si ce n'est que faire plaisir au gouvernement? Étant plutôt passéiste, exception la science, de nature, Les féministes ont toujours eu le don de me faire rager. Elles veulent conserver les avantages des femmes, comme assurance moins chère, congé de maternité prolongé, précédé d'un retrait préventif, tout en s'accaparant de ceux des hommes. Ainsi, c'est une vérité de la palisse que si les Jeux olympiques enlevaient la distinction homme-femme, il n'y aurait de femmes que dans les compétitions gracieuses. Donc les féministes ne se battent pas pour enlever cette barrière. Elles sont tellement opportunistes qu'elles ne négligent pas de profiter des connaissances accumulées par les hommes au cours de l'histoire. Elles essaient toutefois de travestir celles-ci toutes les fois qu'elles le peuvent. Ainsi, l'autre jour, j'ai attendu qu'on aurait des Canadiens et Canadiennes qui ont combattu au front pendant les guerres mondiales. Comment expliquer cela alors que les femmes n'étaient pas autorisées à aller au front? Va-t-on entendre parler des légionnaires et galériennes de César qui naturellement occuperont 50% des effectifs de l'histoire malgré qu'elles n'ont jamais existé? Un vrai casus belli. Désolé pour cette trop compendieuse lettre.
Thank you, Julie, for joining the show to give us that reading in French. And now, as loosely translated as I could find it to English, here are the contents of that letter. Forgive the mistakes. I had 15 minutes to write this. Would you note that if I commit suicide today, December 6th, 1989, it is not for economic reasons, for I have waited until I exhausted all of my financial means, even refusing jobs, but for political reasons, because I have decided to send the feminists who have always ruined my life to their maker. For 7 years, life has brought me no joy, and being totally blasé, I have decided to put an end to those viragos. I tried in my youth to enter the forces as an officer cadet, which could have allowed me possibly to get into the arsenal and proceed in a raid. They refused me because of antisocial. I therefore had to wait until this day to execute my plans. In between, I continued my studies in a haphazard way, for they never really interested me, knowing in advance my fate, which did not prevent me from obtaining very good marks, despite my theory of not handing in my work and the lack of studying before exams. Even if the mad killer epithet will be attributed to me by the media, I consider myself a rational erudite that only the arrival of the Grim Reaper has forced to take extreme acts. For why persevere to exist if it is only to please the government? Being rather backward-looking by nature, except for science, the feminists have always enraged me. They want to keep their advantages of being women, for example, cheaper insurance, extended maternity leave preceded by a preventative leave, etc., while seizing for themselves those of men. Thus, it's an obvious truth that if the Olympic Games removed the men-women distinction, there would be women only in the graceful events. So, the feminists are not fighting to remove that barrier. They are so opportunistic that they do not neglect to profit from the knowledge accumulated by men through the ages. They always try to misrepresent them every time that they can. Thus, the other day I heard they were honoring the Canadian men and women who fought at the front line during the World Wars. How can you explain that, since women were not authorized to go to the front lines? Will we hear of Caesar's female legions and female galley slaves who, of course, took up 50% of the ranks of history, though they never existed? A real casus belli. Sorry for this too brief letter. Marc Lépine. In the aftermath of this tragedy, as you can imagine, everyone was and still is to this day looking for answers. A police psychiatrist would say after interviewing Marc's family and friends that he may have had a very serious personality disorder. He believed this, at least partially, because Marc had chosen the multiple homicide-suicide strategy that is characteristic of this type of disorder. The psychiatrist also said that he noted extreme narcissistic vulnerability that was shown through the fantasies of power and success that Marc had, and also the high levels of self-criticism that he had. Marc also had great difficulty dealing with struggles, rejections, and failures. Marc was someone who always blamed others for his shortfalls. For example, as mentioned, he blamed women who were in his program at École Polytechnique rather than recognizing that he had tentatively been accepted, but he needed to get work done to start. Marc also had feelings of powerlessness and incompetence, and those were compensated for him by a violent and grandiose imaginary life. Other psychiatrists have said that Marc was psychotic and that he had completely lost all touch with reality as he tried to erase the memories of a brutal and absent father, and of a mom who was absent as she was forced to take care of her family, and of a life where he was essentially forced to be subservient to a working woman. He believed that he had been brought up as a victim of the things that he himself hated. Others still have hypothesized that perhaps Marc suffered from brain damage because of the abuse at a young age at the hands of his father, and that may have made things more difficult for him as he faced later losses and rejections in life. Marc's mom, Monique, speculated that he may have suffered from attachment disorder because of the abuse and the sense of abandonment that he had experienced as a child. She also wondered if Marc had viewed her as a feminist, and that the massacre may have been an unconscious attempt for him to get revenge for her neglect while she pursued her career, and also an unconscious attack on his sister's never-ending taunts. For most, though, this was an example of misogynistic violence against women. Criminologists largely view this massacre as an example of a hate or bias crime against women. Believe it or not, though, many people, especially anti-feminists, have said that this was just a multiple homicide and that it was not rooted in any doctrine. To me, that can only be summed up as a denial, and ridiculous, as it appears very clear that he targeted women, and it appears very clear through his words, both verbally and written, that this was a deep resentment for women in general, but especially women who were feminists or taking jobs from men. Sadly, and pathetically if you ask me, anti-feminists have even sought over the years to champion Marc and rehabilitate his character because he's viewed as a hero to their cause of anti-feminism. This makes me sick. I don't understand how anyone with any cause can hold up a mass murderer, and if they do, I think that that's a true and certainly sure sign that they too should be closely monitored and checked out. In the aftermath of this tragedy, Nadia died at the age of 28 when she died from a cocaine overdose, and it's been reported that she lived with great regret at the fact that she had not reconciled with her brother and got her own life back together for his benefit. In 2008, Monique published a book after largely staying out of the public eye after the massacre. Monique started to speak up in 2006 in the wake of another school shooting on Canadian soil, the Dawson College shooting. Her book is called Aftermath, and it's a memoir of her own journey through the grief and pain of the incident. Finally, Canadians mark December 6th annually as the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women, to commemorate, of course, this tragedy and the many, many, many tragedies that have taken place and continue to take place every year and every day that mark violence against women. Just another true and terrifying tale of what can go wrong when people are not properly diagnosed and people are not properly taken care of and not properly loved. There's plenty of blame to go around in cases like this one, and all of the cases that we cover here on the show for that matter. But of course, it is not my job to point fingers. My job, I believe in part, is to encourage all of you, as I always do, to be better. What that means to me is loving your children, making the right choices, and seeking out help for yourself and those around you if they need it. No matter where you live, there is help available to you, and actions like Marc Lépine took at the École Polytechnique and the countless acts like it that go on every year around us are not the answer. Innocent lives are lost every day, it seems, and they are taken because of the beliefs, the doctrines, and the heartache of others. Others lose their lives at the hands of people that they often did not even know. This week, as you go about your day, love your children and love everyone around you. The world around us is seemingly getting more and more difficult to live in, and we're all rushing all the time. But take the time to stop, to listen, and to love anyone and everyone in your life. You never know how such actions could change their moment, their day, or their lives. For the podcast, I'll be working on 2 more cases this month in the general feed that will cover school shootings, which has been our theme. One on my own, and one later this month with Bailey as the co-host once again. I will also be working hard to put out a second patron-only episode of the show that will cover another school shooting. If you would like to become a supporter of the show, please head over to patreon.com/GBNF podcast and sign up there. There are plenty of perks, including 1 to 2 more episodes every month that are exclusive on that platform. Speaking of Patreon, we had a brand new patron sign up for the show this month, and her name is Chrissy McNeil. I'd like to take a moment to personally thank Chrissy for signing up on the show. Chrissy signed up on the supporter level, which amounts to less than a cup of coffee every month at $3 per month. And aside from this shout out, she will also receive ad-free episodes early when we have ads on the show, and she of course gets access to all past and future patron exclusive content for as long as she remains a patron. Chrissy, thank you so much for supporting the show. Every dollar goes back into making this thing possible, and it's people like you that keep the lights on for the show. If you would like to join like Chrissy, hop over and choose one of the 3 tiers for supporting the show and enjoy everything that we have going on over there. You can also join the conversation on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, or X by searching for Gone But Never Forgotten. And if you like pictures, you can also check out the podcast on YouTube to see some visual aids and sometimes my face as I unpack these cases. Thank you all for your support, however you support, and I hope that I will see you back here again next week for another episode. In the meantime, and in between time, stay safe, be well, and be better.